So, good evening, everybody. I hope you've got a good weekend ahead, and many of you today, tomorrow, and Monday, and in the coming days, will be receiving one of these, one of our packages with our latest Ledger Battlefield brochure for 2020 in it. So, as I do when we bring a new one of these out, it's time for a little bit of a periscope to have a chat about what we've got coming up for this year. We've got a new brochure design, as you can see, from our superb design studio. We've got our usual introduction from our CEO Ian Henry, a bit about what we do, our wall of infamy, our battlefield guides, including some new faces for 2020. Also Holtz, which is our school's battlefield tour brand with Jackie Shaw at the helm. Details of our coaches, and then on to our tours. Now, we've got our mainstay tours at the beginning of the brochure this year, D-Day and so on. We're going back to Normandy for the annual commemoration of D-Day next year. All Quiet on the Western Front, superb introduction to the First World War battlefields. But we've got some new ones this year, a lot of exciting new tours, and this is one that I'm very excited about. This is the Silent Cities, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission story, a special tour that we're doing in conjunction with CWGC next summer, a one-off tour to tell the story of the history of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission after the Great War, with special input from the Commission, from its historians, its interns, its staff, and from our own battlefield guides as we look at some of the key areas connected with it. So that's a one-off tour, special one for next year. Armistice Day, of course, is an important period for us, both on the Somme and in Flanders. We've got a new walking tour for next year, walking the Western Front, not the whole Western Front, but looking at some of the neglected sectors up in the north, and Luz, Fromelles, Arras and Cambrai. We've got our traditional walking the Somme and walking Ypres tours. Our Old Contemptibles tour, which looks at the men of the BEF in 1914. We've got a new Battlefield St Quentin tour, looking at the fighting around the city of Saint-Quentin, largely in 1918. Next year is the 105th anniversary of the Battle of Luz, so we've got a special one-off tour for that, looking at the big push. Passchendaele continues to be important, as does Flanders Fields, to get an understanding of the fighting in Flanders during the First World War. We've got the Marne and the Chemin des Dames, a new tour that looks at the fighting in some of the key battles of the two ends of the war of 1914 and 1918. Our War Poets and War Literature tour, an important aspect of our understanding of the Great War. Tanks and Trenches and Crimson Coast, two of our old favourites. Another new one, Behind the Lines on the Somme, looking at the story of the British Army on the Somme sector, not from the perspective of the front line, but from what happened behind the front during the First World War. The Immortal Salience, one of our guides, Tim, and another Mark, came up with this idea when we were on a battlefield recce to look at some of the neglected areas of Flanders, and also the Battle of the Lys. Pals on the Somme, which we brought in for the centenary of the Battle of the Somme, is still going strong. Still a massive amount of interest for that. Forgotten Battlefields of the First World War looks at some of those neglected tours, not from a walking perspective, but on a coach. Beer and Battlefields, Mark Hope, one of our guys, designed this one with a respectful look at another side of the First World War, and something that many people like to go to Belgium to do, which is sample the fantastic beer and places to stay and visit there. Christmas markets is a sort of a spin-off of that. A lot of people like to go at Christmas time to remember the front as it was then. Gary Ashley, one of our guys, drew up Above the Battlefields, which looks at the war in the air in the First World War. And then we've got our Aftermath tour, which is proving very popular this year, and we always include something on Verdun, one of the key battlefields of World War One. Battlefields of Belgium is a good one for those of you who want to get a sample of a number of different campaigns from Waterloo to World War II. And Western Front End to End is a unique tour to us that drives you along all 450 miles of the Western Front over 9 days and gives you an idea of what the whole front was about. A fantastic tour. Brilliant to guide, brilliant to experience, and amazing sights like the trenches at Massige and the ones in the Rock at La Longe. Quite incredible. Gallipoli, an important battlefield of the First World War, which we cover. Obviously, we can't take our coaches from Calais down there, so we fly in, and then we have a good week on the peninsula looking at the key sites there. Moving on to World War II, we've got Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Offensive of 1944. We've got quite a few new tours connected with that, as we'll see. Dunkirk and Fortress Europe. Next year is the 80th anniversary of Dunkirk, so we've got a special tour going out for that. One tour that I'm very pleased to introduce for this year, for 2020 rather, is Gdansk, opening shots of World War II, looking at the area around Westerplatte, the fighting in Poland in 1939, the occupation of Poland, the Holocaust, and going over to the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters in the east. A great tour, flying in, staying in central Gdansk, an amazing place to visit, and looking at a really key, important part of World War II. Next year is the 80th anniversary of VE Day, so we've got a special UK-based tour where we attend the ceremonies in London and visit the Imperial War Museum, Brookwood, and go down to Portsmouth to look at the preparations for D-Day. Battle for Antwerp, another new one for 2020, where we look at the key fighting around the Scheldt Estuary, the Breskins Pocket, Antwerp itself, and the Walcheren Island. Mark Hope has extended our beer and battlefields into the Ardennes of the Second World War. There's a lot of breweries, including Chimay and Leffe, and we also look at the battlefields there. Panzers in Normandy, which we've been running for a few years, looks at armoured warfare there, is now joined by Panzers in the Ardennes, which looks at tank warfare, not just in 1944, but the German Blitzkrieg through that area in 1940 as well. In addition, to understand the whole sort of Bulge and Ardennes area, we've got, following general pattern, Battlefield Luxembourg, Downfall in Berlin, looks at the end of the Second World War in Germany. Then we've got our Arnhem tours, our 5-day Arnhem and the Rhine crossing tour that looks at the Battle of Arnhem and the follow-on in the Rhineland battles of 1945 and the Reichswald Forest. We've got Operation Market Garden, which looks at the ground component of 30 Corps moving up towards Arnhem and the fighting there, and Walking Arnhem with guides Neil Cherry and Bob Hilton, two very popular Arnhem experts that walk that one, and that's a new one we brought in for this year, which is proving very popular for next year. Race to the Remagen, looking at Aachen and the Rhineland. Jonathan Ball, one of our guides, brought in Battlefield Netherlands, looking at that forgotten Eastern Corridor where the fighting took place in 44-45. The Liberation Route follows D-Day through to Arnhem, looking at the key events of Liberation 1944 and 45. The Maginot Line and Tanks in Town. Maginot Line, of course, the static defences from the beginning of the war. Tanks in Town, a special event that takes place in Mons every year. Our Commando operations tour goes deep into France to look at the Saint-Nazaire raid, commandos in Normandy, and see some of the incredible U-boat pens. France under the jackboot looks at the occupation of France in World War II, goes to places like Oradour-sur-Glane, and looks at the Holocaust at places like Drancy. A U-boat tour, which is incredibly popular this year, takes you to visit the sites in northern Germany where the Kriegsmarine operated, and you get to go in these two original World War II U-boats. Quite incredible to go in there. Really brings the film Das Boot alive. Our classic Air War Europe, which looks at the Dam Busters and the Great Escape, continues, I think, for its 15th or 16th year. Next year is the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Britain, so we've got a special tour for that. We've continued with our superb Lancaster experience, where you get to go in a Lancaster and it does a taxi ride up the runway for nearly half an hour driving around. Quite incredible. We get to explore the aircraft, sit in the pilot's seat, and then you go on a battlefield tour to look at what the Lancs did in Operation Chastise and visiting some of the graves of Bomber Command men. Monte Cassino and the battles in Italy, the D-Day Dodgers are very important. We've got two tours for that, our coach-based one and our air-based one. To follow on from that, we've got the last battles in Italy. It looks at the end of the war in Italy in late 1944 into early 1945, an area where my own father was, so that's one that I've drawn up, an area particularly of interest to me. And then Rise and Fall of the Third Reich looks at the story of Hitler's Germany from the beginning to the end. The Holocaust, something we must never forget. It seems every year that I take groups to Holocaust sites, it becomes more and more important to remember this. And we've got 2 tours to do this. Our long one on a coach that takes you across different parts of Europe looking at the Holocaust, and when you can fly into Krakow and go out to Auschwitz and look at the Krakow ghetto and the story of the Holocaust there, to give you an insight into this important chapter, the darkest chapter in many respects of the Second World War. A new tour brought in by Mark Allen, Malta at War by air, where we fly in and we have a look at that, with some amazing both First and Second World War sites to see. It's not just about Malta GC, it's the importance of Malta as a garrison and hospital in the Great War. Tour to Jersey is always very popular, for the liberation period. Next year is the 80th anniversary of Blitzkrieg, so we have a Blitzkrieg in France tour, looking at the fighting in the French Ardennes, including going to Stonne, where this Charby is. We have a fly tour in to look at the rise and fall of the Third Reich around Munich. Operation Anthropoid, looking at the assassination of Heydrich. And we've just had our first Stalingrad tour go out with Paul Errington as our guide. That's proving very popular. Places filling up very quickly for 2020 on that one. Vietnam War with Scott Brand, again another very popular tour where we go out to Vietnam and look at the Vietnam War, both in the 50s and in the American involvement. And then a bit further afield to America itself, to look at the American Civil War, 2 aspects of that, and the Spanish Civil War, looking at the war before World War II and the Zulu War. And then our Napoleonics period tours with David Warren as one of our mainstay guides and Gary Ashley, the Peninsular War, and 2 different types of Waterloo tours, one for the anniversary and one for walking the battlefields. And we have a Richard III tour, which one of our Richard III expert takes and looks at the story of that, and we attend the Edinburgh Military Tattoo. So that's a brief overview of our largest battlefield brochure, 70-odd pages, huge number of tours, many of them new. You can secure a place on these with a very low deposit. You can go on to ledgerbattlefields.co.uk or ledger.co.uk to order your brochure now. You can ring our hotline, go on live chat and speak to our reservations team. We certainly hope to see you in 2020, and thanks for tuning in.